August 16, 1943, 12:45 a.m. The Baltic coast of Germany, near Peenemünde. The moon, a cold, indifferent marble, offered no illumination as a flight of Avro Lancasters screamed in from the sea, their massive airframes shuddering under the weight of a monumental payload. Below them, shrouded in an almost supernatural quiet, lay the Nazis' most secretive and critical military installation, the Heeresversuchsanstalt Peenemünde, or Army Research Center. This wasn't a tank factory or a U-boat pen. This was the future of warfare, being quietly forged by a charismatic young engineer named Wernher von Braun. Tonight, the Royal Air Force was bringing the judgment of fire. The ground crew, still awake in their barracks, after a grueling 20-hour shift fine-tuning the A-4 rocket, the V2, were the first to hear the low, throbbing drone that grew into a deafening roar. Suddenly, the darkness was ripped apart by the blinding flash of flares dropped by the Pathfinder force, turning the meticulous geometric layout of the complex into a sickly, fluorescent landscape. Seconds later, the heavy thud of the first blockbuster bombs began shaking the earth, not just rattling the windows, but violently flexing the steel girders of the immense, silent test stands. Inside his heavily fortified blockhouse, Major General Walter Dornberger, the military chief of the V2 program, stood by a reinforced steel map table. The impact tremor traveled through the concrete floor and up his legs. He didn't need a report to know what was happening. The British, through meticulous intelligence gathering, had found their forbidden city of science. Dornberger looked over at a young man, barely in his 30s, with keen, intelligent eyes and an impeccably clean uniform. Dr. Wernher von Braun. Von Braun wasn't shaking. His focus was entirely on the survival of his project, his life's work. He could hear the shrapnel pinging off the 3-foot-thick walls outside. This wasn't just an attack on a military target. It was an attempt to murder the dream he and his team had nurtured since they were students experimenting with amateur rockets on a muddy German field. That dream was now the A-4, a liquid-fueled ballistic missile capable of striking a target 200 miles away faster than the speed of sound, the world's first true space rocket. The bombing raid, codenamed Operation Hydra, lasted 50 terrifying minutes. When the smoke finally cleared in the morning, the devastation was immense. The primary production facilities were heavily damaged, but the heart of the research, the testing bunker, and the blueprints locked inside had survived. Tragically, many key civilian personnel, the men who made the precision gyroscopes and the delicate turbopumps, were dead. Most importantly, the RAF had successfully delayed the weapon's deployment by months, perhaps a year. Von Braun surveyed the smoking ruins, his face streaked with soot and grim determination. The military leadership was furious, but von Braun saw a perverse opportunity. The attack proved the significance of their work. The Führer would now have no choice but to pour every conceivable resource into relocating and accelerating production of the V2 Vergeltungswaffe, the vengeance weapon. It was no longer a research project. It was the instrument of retribution, a weapon Hitler desperately needed to break the will of the Allies. But von Braun's mind was already miles ahead of the war's crude objectives. He saw the V2 not as a weapon, but as a proof of concept, a mere stepping stone. Its terrifying power was just the kinetic energy needed to propel his ultimate goal, escaping gravity altogether. To him, the smoke curling from the rubble wasn't the smell of defeat, but the acrid scent of propellant, signaling the start of a far grander journey that would one day take him and his rocket to the moon. He knew that the only way to save his technology, his team, and his own skin from the chaos of a collapsing Reich was to ensure that, when the war finally ended, the victors realized the immense, literally incalculable value of the intellectual property that lay beneath the ruins of Peenemünde. A team of scientists, blueprints for the future of warfare, and a wealth of industrial secrets worth, by conservative post-war estimates, over $10 billion. The hunt for this intellectual gold would soon begin. The final months of the war were a chaotic, desperate race against time and against geography. By early 1945, with Soviet armored columns grinding inexorably westward toward the V2's new underground production facility at Mittelwerk, near Nordhausen, a massive subterranean factory carved out of a mountain, Wernher von Braun made a critical, life-altering decision. He was finished fighting for Hitler. His new objective was simple: deliver his scientific legacy and his entire team into the hands of the Americans. Not the Soviets, who he feared would treat them as slaves, nor the British, whose airmen had bombed his work, but the Americans, who, he believed, possessed the resources and the visionary spirit to carry his research beyond the stratosphere. In February 1945, von Braun staged a seemingly minor accident. While driving on an icy road, he deliberately crashed his military car, severely breaking his left arm. This injury provided him with the necessary medical cover to escape the front lines and secure permission from the ailing Nazi leadership to evacuate his 500 top specialists and their families, along with 14 tons of invaluable technical documents, from the Soviet-threatened Mittelwerk to a remote, safe location in the Bavarian Alps. He chose the small, picturesque town of Oberammergau, near the Austrian border. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, intelligence officers were realizing the true, devastating potential of the V2. Its successful, albeit strategically ineffective, strikes against London and Antwerp had demonstrated that the age of a long-range, unstoppable missile was here. The Allies, particularly the Americans, initiated Operation Overcast, later renamed Operation Paperclip. This was a clandestine mission to identify, detain, and transport German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States before the Soviets or the French could claim them. The primary target, the crown jewels of German science, was von Braun and his entire rocketry team. The American effort was spearheaded by the T-Force, small, specialized military units, whose mission was not to fight the retreating Wehrmacht, but to seize scientific and technological assets. In April 1945, a young American intelligence officer, Major Robert B. Staver, finally located the massive caches of V2 hardware and blueprints near Nordhausen. What he found was staggering. Dozens of complete V2 rockets, assembly lines, and enough technical data to jumpstart an entire national missile program. But the real prize, the men who understood the complex, revolutionary systems, were missing. Major Staver, through tireless interrogation of captured German personnel, finally pieced together the trail leading to Oberammergau. On May 2, 1945, in a forest clearing near the Austrian border, Magnus von Braun, Wernher's younger brother and a fellow rocket engineer, was sent out on a bicycle. He spotted a bewildered American Army private named Freddie Cofield. Magnus, a man who had dedicated his life to serving the Reich, straightened his uniform and, in perfect but formal English, approached the private. "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V2. We want to surrender." The surrender was meticulously orchestrated. Wernher von Braun, still wearing a sling for his broken arm, formally presented himself to the American officers of the 44th Infantry Division. His opening pitch was not a plea for mercy, but an offer of unprecedented value. He didn't just surrender a team of men. He surrendered the key to conquering space. "We knew that we had created a new means of warfare," von Braun would later recall. "And the question was, who would have the privilege of taking us over?" He made it abundantly clear that his team was intact, his documentation was secure, and he was ready to begin work immediately, not on missiles for the next war, but on rockets for the moon. The Americans had won the lottery of scientific intellect, snatching the entire Peenemünde cohort away from the Soviets by mere days. The long, complex journey of the Nazi rocket scientists into the heart of America was about to begin, starting with a heavily guarded convoy carrying the most important prisoners of the war. The initial phase of Operation Paperclip was shrouded in a complex, almost absurd layer of military bureaucracy designed to obfuscate the truth. Wernher von Braun and the other 117 top members of his team were officially listed not as crucial American employees, but as special employees of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps, housed initially at Fort Bliss, Texas, and the nearby White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. They were prisoners, yet they were being given extraordinary latitude, the best possible living quarters, and access to equipment necessary to continue their pioneering work. Their contracts were highly secretive, and the moral and ethical implications of importing key personnel from the Nazi regime, many of whom had used slave labor from the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp to build the V2, were deliberately and methodically suppressed by the U.S. government. For von Braun, this relocation was a liberation, a second chance to pursue his vision of space travel under vastly superior conditions. He was no longer working for a crumbling totalitarian regime. He was working for the nation with the deepest pockets and the longest vision for the future. The deserts of New Mexico, vast and empty, became the new testing ground for the captured V-2s, painstakingly reassembled from the salvaged components shipped across the Atlantic in Operation Backfire. The first launch of an American-assembled V-2 occurred in April 1946. Von Braun and his team, now supervising American soldiers and engineers, watched as their familiar rocket climbed skyward. They were not mere advisors, they were the essential knowledge base. The Americans, brilliant in industrial production, were decades behind the German rocketry curve. The Germans held all the proprietary secrets, the complex turbopump design, the gimbal thrust mechanism for steering, and the precise chemical composition of the fuel mixture. Without von Braun and his men, the American missile program would have been paralyzed. Life at Fort Bliss was surreal. These former enemies were essentially running a major defense program, teaching their captors the fundamentals of an entirely new science. They taught classes on supersonic aerodynamics, liquid propulsion systems, and inertial guidance. Yet they were still under guard, their families delayed in Germany for years, a constant pressure point used by the military to ensure compliance. The ethical tightrope they walked was steep. They were pioneers of science, but their hands were indelibly marked by the horrors of the concentration camp labor that had sustained their work. Despite the moral compromises, the American rocket program began its hesitant crawl forward. The Germans were quickly put to work on the successor to the V-2, the Project Hermes rockets, which evolved into the Redstone short-range ballistic missile. The Redstone would be the critical precursor, a scaled-up, more reliable version of the V-2 that would eventually carry the first American satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit in 1958. The real transformation came with the onset of the Cold War. As the Soviet Union, led by its own captured German rocket scientists, who were treated far more harshly, detonated its first atomic bomb and accelerated its missile programs, von Braun and his paperclip colleagues morphed, in the eyes of the Pentagon, from questionable war trophies into absolutely indispensable national assets. The fear of Soviet technological dominance provided the perfect political cover to fully integrate the German team into the American defense structure. By 1950, von Braun and the core of his team were officially transferred to Huntsville, Alabama, a sleepy southern town that would soon be nicknamed Rocket City, USA. It was here on the banks of the Tennessee River that the final transition would occur, cementing the destiny of the paperclip scientists and laying the foundation for a weapon that would not target a city, but the very heavens themselves. The move to Huntsville, Alabama, marked the true beginning of von Braun's integration into American society and the massive expansion of his influence. The facility, originally named the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, ABMA, quickly became the intellectual powerhouse of American rocketry. Von Braun was not just a director. He was a celebrity scientist, managing hundreds of military and civilian employees, all dedicated to the escalating demands of the Cold War. The core challenge remained the same as it had been at Peenemünde, building increasingly powerful rockets. The Redstone missile was a success, but the Army needed something with an intercontinental range. This led von Braun's team, the 118 Germans, including propulsion expert Kurt Debus and guidance guru Ernst Stullinger, now all green card holders and soon-to-be citizens, to develop the Jupiter Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile and its more powerful evolution, the Juno series. Then came the Sputnik shock of October 4, 1957, when the Soviet Union launched the world's first artificial satellite. The tiny, beeping sphere sent shock waves of panic through the American political and military establishment. Suddenly, the decade-long efforts of von Braun, previously viewed by many as an expensive, ethically murky curiosity, became the most vital project in the nation. The technological race instantly shifted from war fighting to space superiority. The Soviets had not just launched a satellite, they had demonstrated a capability the U.S. did not possess, reliable, high-thrust rocket power capable of reaching orbit. Under immense pressure, the U.S. scrambled. Within months, von Braun's Redstone-derived Juno I rocket successfully launched Explorer-1, America's first satellite, finally getting the U.S. into the space race. This success validated von Braun's leadership and established his team as the uncontested masters of large-scale liquid-fueled rocketry. The political climate changed overnight, providing the ultimate moral absolution for the paperclip scientists. Their past service to the Nazi regime was now framed as a necessary prelude to saving America from Soviet domination. In the ensuing fervor, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was created in 1958. Recognizing the unparalleled competence and infrastructure of the Huntsville team, NASA absorbed the ABMA, forming the nucleus of what would become the Marshall Space Flight Center, MSFC. Wernher von Braun was appointed its first director, a position of unprecedented influence for a naturalized German citizen. With the moon now firmly established as the ultimate objective by President John F. Kennedy in 1961, von Braun faced his life's most formidable engineering challenge. To send 3 men to the moon, land them, and return them safely required a rocket of unimaginable scale and power. The Jupiter and Redstone were mere fireworks compared to what was needed. Von Braun, channeling all the expertise gleaned from the V2's complex engine mechanics, the Jupiter's robust staging, and his lifelong theoretical work, began sketching the architecture for the Saturn V. This rocket would require 5 massive engines in its first stage, each generating over 1.5 million pounds of thrust. The paperclip legacy was built directly into its genetic code. The F-1 engine, the most powerful single-chamber liquid-fueled rocket engine ever built, was the direct, albeit enormously scaled-up, descendant of the V-2's simple combustion chamber. The German scientists were no longer assembling captured technology. They were designing the impossible, turning the V-2, Hitler's feared vengeance weapon, into the ultimate vehicle of human aspiration. The culmination of their journey was now fully focused on a single monumental goal: a clean, white ship of destiny, the $363-foot-tall Saturn V, rising from the swamps of Florida, ready to launch a new era. The development and testing phase of the Saturn V was the crowning achievement of the paperclip cohort. At the Marshall Space Flight Center, Wernher von Braun presided over a dedicated army of engineers, but the critical breakthroughs, the complex integration of 3 massive stages, the deep cryogenic hydrogen fueling system for the upper stages, and the flawless guidance computers, all relied on the intellectual foundation brought from Peenemünde. The core German team, now American citizens and executives, occupied the highest positions. Eberhard Ries served as von Braun's deputy, Arthur Rudolph led the crucial Saturn V production office, and Kurt Debus oversaw the launch complex at Cape Canaveral, then Cape Kennedy. They had seamlessly transferred their institutional memory, built on years of painstaking trial and error with the V2, into the structure of America's space effort. The towering presence of the Saturn V on the launch pad at Launch Complex 39A was more than just a testament to engineering. It was a physical manifestation of a profound, and often morally avoided, historical transaction. The rocket's power, the very force that would break the bonds of Earth's gravity, was fundamentally linked to the suffering of the thousands of concentration camp prisoners who had died assembling its terrifying predecessor, the V2, in the tunnels of Mittelwerk. This moral calculus was the price of American victory in the space race, a silent, heavy shadow cast over every success. On July 16, 1969, the day of the Apollo 11 launch, the world held its breath. Wernher von Braun, standing in the control room, watched as the 5 colossal F-1 engines ignited, generating a plume of fire and thunder that shook the Florida coastline for miles. It was the loudest machine ever built by man. That immense, organized violence of thrust was the ultimate fulfillment of the youthful dream he had sketched decades earlier on the Baltic coast. The rocket, the final product of his team's migration, lifted the 3 astronauts toward the moon, proving the technological superiority of the United States. 4 days later, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, the victory was undeniably America's, but the intellectual lineage stretched directly back to to the defeated German Reich. The Saturn V, designed and executed by the Paperclip scientists, had fulfilled von Braun's prophecy. A weapon of vengeance transformed into a vehicle of peace and exploration. The investment, the $10 billion worth of captured knowledge, the acceptance of former Nazi Party members into the highest echelons of government science, had paid the highest dividend imaginable. Wernher von Braun had achieved his destiny, becoming one of the most recognized and influential scientists of the 20th century. However, the ethical compromise remained permanently written into the history of NASA. While von Braun and his colleagues successfully navigated their transformation from servants of Hitler to heroes of the Cold War, the story of Operation Paperclip remains a stark reminder that in the desperate theater of global conflict and technological race, scientific brilliance often transcends moral scrutiny. The Saturn V gave America the moon, but its foundation was built on a dark and complex history, a price paid not by the victors, but by the forgotten victims of the world's first true ballistic missile.